welcome back to another video. Let's talk about how auto exposure bracketing works, and at the end I'm going to give you 3 top secrets so you can be a master bracketeer. So a lot can go into taking a photograph, but when the conditions are not ideal, it may be time to take an HDR photo. Let's introduce AEB into the scenario. Say you're doing some real estate photography and there's some beautiful golden light diving into the kitchen area, and you want to take a photo of that beautiful golden light, but at the same time you want the viewer of your image to see a little bit of that beautiful backyard. That's where AEB, or auto exposure bracketing, is one way to accomplish an HDR image. At the end of this video, I will point you towards a video I created earlier on all the details and information on how to set up your Canon EOS R6 with auto exposure bracketing. Now let's understand what the camera is trying to do when you are in auto exposure bracketing mode, or AEB mode. So here are the quick steps to getting your camera set up. I've enabled AEB mode in the shoot menu on the camera, and I've set the number of exposures to 3. In this case, I'm shooting in Aperture Priority mode, which means each bracketed image will be affected by the shutter speed to introduce a +3 or -3 value for each image, plus a standard image. Consequently, I could be shooting in shutter priority mode, and that would affect the aperture, the f-stop, for each of those images, just as I explained. As I just mentioned, take a look at each of these images as they get processed within the camera, and you can see there's a +3 value, a -3 value, and a standard value for each of the images. Now we can transfer our set of images to a photo editor that supports combining images such as HDR images. I'm using Lightroom, and we can select all the images and create a stack that will attempt to provide you with a combined image that will minimize the highlights and maximize your dark areas. Now you have a photo that you can edit to knock down some of the extreme highlights and dark areas and edit to your taste. Some use cases for auto exposure bracketing or HDR images would be real estate photography or even landscape photography, where you have a sunrise or sunset time of the day where your subject is backlit, but you want to create that exposure, the right exposure, all the way throughout the image. You can do your best to try to create an HDR image by using auto exposure bracketing in this case. Just remember, this isn't the only way you can create an HDR image. You can do it also manually and create the exposures in camera one at a time, and do it that way, and then combine them in post or in your editing software. So you can certainly do that. But let's say you want to pre-program AEB to be on one of your memorized channels within your camera, and then you have a high dynamic range, something that's happening really fast. You can shoot off 3 images really quick, and in this case you can also just utilize one of the 3 images, knowing that you're going to get one that's a little bit more overexposed, underexposed, and one standard image, and you could just edit one of those images to try to get something that's to your taste. But the idea here is to automate the process and do it really quick, and just have it in the back of your mind that you want to create this HDR image based on speed, let's say. This might be something you consider in the future. Now let's talk about the top 3 secrets that I mentioned earlier that rarely get talked about when mentioning AEB, or auto exposure bracketing. Number 1 is, if you're not set to high-speed continuous on your camera, you're going to have to depress the shutter button for each bracketed image. It will be manual, but if you're set to high-speed continuous, you just hold down the shutter button and it will click off each image until it's done making the brackets. The second top secret that you have to keep in mind is what I call exposure exhaustion. And what I'm talking about there is, let's say you're shooting in shutter priority mode. That means that your aperture is going to change for each of the bracketed images. And let's say you're shooting your standard image at f2.8 and you want to get a little bit higher exposure or overexposed. It's going to want to go lower than 2.8, but it can't. So that means it's just going to take another standard image, and that's not what you want. It's not doing what you wanted and get an overexposed and an underexposed image. So what that means is you have to try to get your camera settings right for that standard image early on, so then it will allow you to under and overexpose. So let's say we go to f5.6, then it can go down to 2.8, and then maybe up to f8, or whatever the case may be, depending on what are the increments or stops that you're going to over and underexpose an image. The same idea would be true if you're shooting in aperture priority mode. That would mean that your shutter speed is going to be affected up and down, so it's going to be faster and slower, and for whatever it calls for to get those overexposures and underexposures. Let's say your camera's calling for 40 seconds for whatever reason, but let's say it's calling for 40 seconds and your camera only goes to 30 seconds, or you have it programmed to only go to 20 seconds, let's say, then the camera's not going to be able to get that bracketed image that's going to allow that much more light to overexpose your image, and therefore it's going to shoot or revert or default to a standard image, and you're not going to get the true brackets that you wanted, the 3 shots, the 5 shots, the 7 shots, this, let's say in this case. So just remember, exposure exhaustion is a thing, especially when you're shooting bracketed images in AEB. And the third top secret is going to support you in that second top secret. If you want to try to avoid exposure exhaustion, then use the safety shift mode. In this case, what it's going to allow you to do is try to override or go to a different mode when it can't go, let's say, to a slower shutter speed or to a very fast aperture. It's going to use, let's say, the ISO mode, or in reverse, it might use the shutter speed or the aperture within aperture priority or shutter priority and just go ahead and open the shutter more or open the aperture more. Wherever the camera can actually provide light and take away light, it's going to try to do that with the safety shift. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail here about the safety shift, but if you want me to make a video about that, just let me know. I hope that was helpful. I'll see you on the next one. Love y'all. Peace.